Oh, Maya's here. Everyone, my little sister finally made it, Claire announced as I walked into the private dining room at Meridian, her voice carrying that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over 28 years, the one that sounded like affection, but carved like a blade. She stood near the bar in a dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, her hand extended to show off the engagement ring that caught the light with deliberate precision, and beside her stood Derek, her fiancé, tall and confident in his tailored suit, already looking at me with that expression I'd seen too many times before, the one that said he'd already decided I wasn't worth his full attention. "We were worried you got lost," Claire continued, and several guests turned to look at me, their smiles polite but distant, and I felt the familiar weight settling onto my shoulders, the invisible pressure of being the lesser daughter, the forgettable sister, the one who never quite measured up. "Sorry I'm late," I said, keeping my voice steady even as my heart hammered against my ribs. Traffic on I-5 was terrible. Derek stepped forward, and I noticed how he positioned himself slightly in front of Claire, protective and proprietary. "Maya, right? Claire's told me all about you," he said, extending his hand for a shake that felt performative, his grip firm but brief, already withdrawing before the gesture was complete. "You work in marketing or something, don't you? One of those little social media jobs?" The dismissal in his voice was casual, thoughtless, the kind of cruelty that doesn't even recognize itself as cruel because it's so deeply embedded in assumption. I felt my mother approach before I saw her, her perfume announcing her presence, and when she kissed my cheek, it was the kind of kiss that looked warm from a distance, but landed cold. "Darling, you should have worn something more formal," she said, her eyes scanning my dress, which was perfectly appropriate, but would never be enough, could never be enough because I was wearing it. "This is an important night for your sister. Derek is director level at Tech Vision Solutions, you know. Very prestigious." I knew. I knew exactly what Derek's position was, knew the company hierarchy, knew the budgets and the projects and the campaigns that had earned him his recent promotion, but I said nothing because I'd learned that speaking up only created more opportunities for dismissal. "It's nice to finally meet you properly," Derek said, already turning back toward the bar, toward the other guests who mattered more. "Claire mentioned you do some freelance work or something. That's nice. Everyone needs hobbies." The words hit like they always did, landing in that tender place I'd tried so hard to protect, and I stood there in my appropriate but not quite right dress, surrounded by 50 people celebrating my sister's happiness, and I felt the weight of 4 years of building something extraordinary, something that would make most people's accomplishments pale in comparison, pressing against my silence. I was the CEO of a digital marketing empire worth $47 million, employing 200 people, working with some of the biggest tech firms in Seattle, and my family had no idea because they'd never bothered to ask, had never considered that quiet, forgettable Maya might have something worth hearing. Standing in that dining room, surrounded by celebration I didn't quite belong to, I felt the familiar ache of being Claire's sister settle into my bones, and my mind drifted back through the years of accumulated dismissals, the 1,000 small cuts that had taught me my place in the family hierarchy. We'd been the quiet one and the golden child since we were small, Claire with her cheerleading trophies and homecoming crowns, me with my books and straight A's that nobody thought to celebrate because academic achievement was expected, not remarkable. And somewhere along the way, I'd accepted the narrative they'd written for me, the story that said Claire was the success and I was the one who tried hard but never quite shone. I remembered 3 years ago when Claire had called me crying about an unexpected tax bill, how she'd needed $5,000 immediately, and I'd transferred the money within an hour because that's what sisters do, and she'd promised to pay me back within 3 months, but 3 months became 6, became a year, became never mentioned again. And when I'd gently brought it up once, she'd looked at me like I was being petty for remembering. I thought about my college graduation from the University of Washington, how I'd earned my bachelor's degree in business with a 3.9 GPA, and my mother had missed the ceremony because Claire had a hair appointment for some party that same weekend. And when I'd mentioned feeling hurt, my mother had said I was being dramatic because graduations happen all the time, but Claire's social life was important for her development. There was my master's degree 2 years later, completed while working full-time, and my mother had come to that ceremony but spent the entire lunch afterward talking about Claire's new boyfriend, and I'd sat there with my diploma in my bag feeling invisible, even on the day that was supposed to be mine. Claire had mocked my first apartment when I was 23, the small one-bedroom in Capitol Hill that I'd been so proud to afford on my own, calling it the shoebox, and asking when I was going to get a real place like hers. Never mind that her real place was subsidized by our mother's monthly checks. Every promotion I'd earned in those early years had been met with polite disinterest. My excitement dismissed with casual comments about how office jobs were all the same anyway, and when I'd started my company at 24, working 16-hour days and risking everything I had, my family had nodded vaguely and changed the subject because entrepreneurship was risky and uncomfortable, and Claire was doing well at her marketing coordinator position at a mid-sized firm, which seemed more solid, more real, more worthy of attention. Derek had entered our family dynamic 2 years ago, and he'd immediately absorbed the established pattern, treating me with the same casual dismissal my mother and sister had perfected, never asking questions about my work, never showing interest in my life, and I'd watched him slot himself into their narrative where I was the lesser daughter, the one who needed advice and guidance, the one who hadn't quite figured out how to be successful. None of them had ever asked the right questions, had never wondered why I worked such long hours, or traveled so frequently, or seemed comfortable in ways that should have required more money than they assumed I made, and I'd stopped trying to tell them because every attempt had been interrupted or redirected or simply ignored, and eventually I'd realized that my success was mine alone, built without their support and perhaps more valuable because of it. The memories dissolved as someone called for everyone to take their seats, and I found myself back in the present moment, surrounded by the crystalline light of Meridian's private dining room, where 50 guests settled into their chairs around tables decorated with white roses and gold accents that probably cost more than I'd spent on my entire first year of business operations. The restaurant occupied the top floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. And I'd been here before for business dinners with clients who never knew they were dining with someone whose family considered her a failure. I made my way to the table where my place card sat between an aunt I barely knew and an empty chair, noting that Claire and Derek commanded the center of the room at a head table that elevated them literally and figuratively above the rest of us. And I watched as Derek stood to refresh his drink at the bar, his voice carrying across the room with that particular projection that suggested he was performing for an audience. The director-level position came through last quarter, he was saying to a cluster of guests who'd gathered around him like he was dispensing wisdom from on high. Tech Vision Solutions doesn't hand out those titles lightly. You have to prove yourself in the tech industry, show that you can handle major campaigns and significant budgets. His eyes found mine across the room, and I saw the casual dismissal there, the certainty that his accomplishments dwarfed anything I might have achieved. Claire joined him, her left hand positioned deliberately to catch the light, and the engagement ring threw sparkles across the walls. $15,000 of diamond and platinum that she'd posted on social media within minutes of receiving it. The caption reading, "He went to Tiffany's because he knows I deserve the best." "Maya, come here," Claire called, beckoning me over with a wave that looked warm but felt like a summons, and I walked toward them because refusing would have caused a scene, would have made me the difficult one, the sister who couldn't be happy for Claire's success. "Tell everyone what you do." Derek was just talking about the tech industry, and I realized we never really explained your little marketing thing. The words "little marketing thing" landed exactly as she'd intended them to, diminishing and dismissive, and I opened my mouth to respond, to finally say something about Catalyst Digital and the empire I'd built. But Derek jumped in before I could form a complete sentence. Oh, marketing is such a broad field, he said with the condescending patience of someone explaining simple concepts to a child. A lot of people think they understand it because they use social media or send out some emails, but real digital marketing at the enterprise level is incredibly complex. At TechVision, we only work with top-tier agencies because the campaigns we run require sophisticated strategy and serious technical integration. It's not just about posting pretty pictures on Instagram. I felt something shift inside me, a tectonic plate of patience finally reaching its breaking point. And I caught sight of Jen across the room, my friend from college who was one of the few people here who actually knew me, and she was watching this exchange with an expression that mixed sympathy and barely contained fury. My mother appeared at Claire's elbow, her smile bright and proprietary as she surveyed her golden daughter's engagement party. "Derek's being modest," my mother said, touching his arm with familiar affection. "He's accomplished so much at such a young age. Maya, you should really talk to him about career development. He could give you some pointers about what it takes to succeed in a competitive industry." The evening progressed with the steady accumulation of small cruelties, each one building on the last until I felt like I was drowning in dismissal, and I found myself cataloging each incident with the strange detachment of someone who'd learned to protect themselves by observing rather than fully feeling. Derek had positioned himself near the bar where a rotating audience of guests could admire his expertise. And at one point, he launched into an elaborate explanation of digital marketing strategy directed at me, his tone that of a professor addressing a particularly slow student, explaining concepts like SEO optimization and conversion funnels and customer journey mapping, as if I hadn't spent the last 4 years building campaigns around precisely these principles for some of the largest companies in the Pacific Northwest. "The thing most people don't understand about digital marketing," he said, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that probably looked friendly, but felt condescending, "is that it's not just about being creative or having good ideas. It's about data analysis and technical implementation, and that's where a lot of smaller operations fall short because they just don't have the infrastructure." I smiled and nodded because contradicting him would have made me the difficult one, the sister who couldn't handle helpful advice, and I caught Jen's eye across the room where she was gripping her wine glass so hard I thought the stem might snap. When the conversation turned to wedding plans, Claire announced that she'd chosen bridesmaid dresses from a boutique designer, her voice bright with excitement as she described the silk and custom fitting, and then she turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and said, "They're $800 each, but I know that's probably steep for you, so maybe you could do a reading instead of being in the wedding party. That way you wouldn't have to worry about the cost." The suggestion landed with the weight of public humiliation, the assumption of my poverty delivered as consideration, as kindness, and I saw several guests shift uncomfortably because even they could recognize the cruelty wrapped in concern. Derek's parents arrived late, his mother elegant in designer clothes, and his father carrying the confident bearing of generational wealth. And they made their way to our table with warm greetings, and when his mother asked me about my career with what seemed like genuine interest, Claire answered before I could open my mouth, saying, "Oh, Maya works in marketing, one of those small digital agencies. You know how it is with startups, lots of hustle, but she's still finding her footing." I watched Claire rewrite my reality with casual confidence, diminishing my empire to a struggling startup, my 4 years of success to still finding her footing, and Derek's mother nodded sympathetically and told me to keep trying, because you never know when things might take off. My father sat quietly at the far end of the table, divorced from my mother for 6 years now, and still somehow diminished in family gatherings. And when I caught his eye, I saw sympathy there, but no intervention, no defense, just the sad acknowledgement of someone who'd learned that speaking up cost more than it gained. Throughout the evening, I noticed a man I recognized sitting with Derek's colleagues from Tech Vision Solutions. His name was Brad, something, and I'd seen him in virtual meetings, sitting in the background of video calls when my team presented campaigns to his company's marketing department, and he kept glancing at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, something between recognition and confusion, But he said nothing, and I filed that information away for later. The sound of silverware against crystal cut through the ambient noise as someone called for attention, and I watched Derek rise from his seat at the head table with the easy confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to command a room, his hand smoothing his tie in a gesture I'd seen him make a dozen times before, always preceding moments when he wanted to impress. "I'd like to say a few words," he announced, and the room settled into expectant silence, 50 faces turning toward him with the polite attention reserved for these ritualistic moments, and I felt my stomach tighten because I knew somehow that whatever came next would find a way to diminish me even in Claire's spotlight. When you work hard in this world, when you build success through dedication at real companies with real stakes, you learn what achievement actually means, he began, and his eyes swept the room before landing on me for just a fraction of a second, long enough for me to understand the message embedded in his words. Claire and I have both been fortunate to build careers that matter, to work in industries that shape the future, and I think that shared understanding of what it takes to succeed at the highest levels is part of what makes us perfect for each other. The applause was warm and I joined it mechanically, my hands coming together while something cold and hard crystallized in my chest, 4 years of accumulated dismissal suddenly weighing on me like physical pressure. Claire stood next, radiant in a dress that probably cost more than my first office rent, and she smiled at the assembled guests with the grace of someone who'd always been celebrated, always been seen. "I just want to thank everyone who matters for being here tonight," she said, and I told myself the omission wasn't deliberate, that she didn't mean to suggest that some people present didn't matter, but the words landed anyway and I felt them. My mother rose last, champagne glass catching the light, and her voice carried that particular tone of maternal pride that I'd spent 28 years hoping might someday be directed at me. "To my daughter Claire, who is finally achieving something truly significant in her life, building a future that makes a mother proud," she said, and then added with a laugh that was probably meant to sound warm. "Unlike some people who are still figuring things out, Claire has always known what she wanted and had the drive to make it happen." The room laughed politely, and I felt Jen's hand find mine under the table, her grip tight and furious, and she leaned close enough to whisper, "Say something, Maya, please. They don't deserve your protection anymore." The memories flooded back unbidden, sitting in my office 4 years ago when I'd signed the paperwork incorporating Catalyst Digital with $5,000 in the bank and a laptop and a dream that everyone told me was unrealistic, remembering the first client and the first employee, and the first time I'd realized that I'd built something real, something that mattered, watching my company grow to 200 employees and a $47 million valuation and client contracts with 17 of the 50 largest tech companies in the country, including Tech Vision Solutions, where Derek worked and preened and dismissed me as someone still figuring things out. I'd kept my success private deliberately, telling myself I wanted relationships based on genuine connection rather than money or status, wanting to be valued for who I was rather than what I'd built. But sitting there listening to toasts that erased my existence, I understood with sudden clarity that silence had become complicity in my own diminishment, that by protecting others from the discomfort of knowing they'd misjudged me, I'd allowed them to continue misjudging me, and something in me that had bent for years under the weight of dismissal finally straightened into resolve. I set my champagne glass down with deliberate care and felt my voice emerge steady and clear when I said, "I'd like to make a toast as well, if that's all right." And the request hung in the air for a moment before Claire's face arranged itself into an expression of patronizing indulgence, the look of someone granting permission to a child who wanted to show off a crayon drawing. "Of course," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We'd love to hear from you, Maya." And I stood slowly, feeling the attention of 50 guests shift toward me with that polite curiosity people reserve for the awkward family member who might say something embarrassing. I began carefully, my words measured and calm despite the adrenaline coursing through me, talking about family and what success really means. about building something meaningful and the different paths people take in their careers. And I mentioned working in digital marketing, which prompted a few nods from people who'd already written me off as someone in a minor profession. Derek couldn't help himself. His need to demonstrate superiority apparently stronger than his ability to read the room. And he interrupted with, "The thing about boutique agencies is they mean well, but they just can't compete with the established players. The ones that companies like Tech Vision actually trust with serious money and serious campaigns." I paused just long enough to let his words settle before continuing smoothly, mentioning that I'd actually worked with several major tech firms over the past few years, companies that Derek would certainly recognize, and I saw his expression shift slightly toward confusion, toward the first hint that perhaps he'd miscalculated something. "Actually," Derek said, leaning back in his chair with renewed confidence, Tech Vision has extremely high standards for our marketing partnerships. We only work with top-tier agencies like Catalyst Digital. They're based here in Seattle, and they're basically the gold standard for digital marketing in tech. I doubt many people in this room would even recognize the name, but in our industry, everyone knows them. I felt my lips curve into a small smile, the kind that probably looked mysterious to the guests who were now paying much closer attention because they could sense something shifting in the dynamic, even if they couldn't quite identify what. "I know Catalyst Digital quite well, actually," I said, and the words came out softer than Derek's booming pronouncements, but somehow carried more weight, and I watched his colleague Brad go very still at his table, watched recognition finally dawn on his face in a way that made his eyes go wide. Claire tried to redirect with, "Maya, this is lovely, but maybe we should let people enjoy their dinner." But I continued speaking with the same calm tone, building toward something that felt both terrifying and liberating. And the guests were fully attentive now, drinks forgotten, and conversations abandoned because they could feel the tension building toward revelation. "I founded Catalyst Digital," I said, and the words dropped into the room like a stone into still water, the ripples of silence spreading outward until even the waitstaff paused in their movements, and for a heartbeat, nobody spoke or moved or seemed to breathe. Derek's laugh came first, sharp and disbelieving, the sound of someone so certain of their worldview that contradictory evidence registers as comedy rather than truth, and he shook his head with that same condescending smile he'd worn all evening. "Maya, come on, this isn't funny, you're embarrassing yourself," he said, and Claire's face had gone tight with something between concern and anger, her voice low and urgent when she added, "Maya, stop it. Everyone knows you work at some small firm. You don't need to make up stories." I reached into my bag with steady hands and pulled out the business card I always carried, simple cream cardstock with elegant typography, and I held it up so the nearby guests could see before placing it on the table in front of Derek. "Maya Chen, Chief Executive Officer, Catalyst Digital." Derek picked it up and his smile faltered slightly, but he recovered quickly, his voice still dismissive when he said, "Anyone can print business cards, Maya. This is just sad." Brad had gone completely pale at his table 10 feet away, his water glass frozen halfway to his lips, and I met his eyes directly when I said, "Brad, you've been to our offices on 4th Avenue, you've sat in my conference room. Would you mind confirming for everyone who I am?" The silence that followed felt heavy with anticipation, and I watched Brad struggle visibly, his loyalty to his colleague Derek warring with the truth, and with whatever professional instinct told him that lying to a CEO who controlled millions in contracts would be spectacularly unwise. "She's telling the truth," Brad finally said, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet room. "Maya Chen is the founder and CEO of Catalyst Digital. I've been in meetings with her. Our entire marketing strategy comes through her company." Derek's face went through a remarkable transformation, confidence draining away to be replaced by confusion, and then the first creeping edge of horror as the implications began to register, and he stammered, "But you never said, you never mentioned," which was so absurd given the evening's events that I almost laughed. The company has 206 employees as of last month, I continued calmly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline making my hands shake slightly. Our revenue last year was $47 million. We have contracts with 17 major tech companies, including Tech Vision Solutions, and we've won 4 industry awards in the past 18 months for campaign innovation and effectiveness. Claire's champagne glass hit the table harder than she'd intended, the sound sharp enough to make several guests jump, and my mother's face had gone completely blank in that way it did when she encountered something her worldview couldn't immediately process. In fact, I added, looking directly at Derek, whose expression had progressed from disbelief to something approaching panic, Brad can probably also confirm that the campaign that led to your promotion 3 months ago, the one you mentioned earlier this evening, was designed and executed by my team. I signed off on the strategy personally in January. Brad nodded slowly, his discomfort visible as he confirmed, "That's correct. The Q4 campaign that Derek led, the strategy came from Catalyst." And I watched Derek's face cycle through several shades of pale, while his parents exchanged glances that suggested they were reassessing everything their son had said about his own capabilities. I turned my attention fully to Derek then, my voice still calm, but carrying an edge of steel that I rarely used, and said, "Your company's contract with Catalyst Digital is worth $2.3 million annually, and it's been one of our most stable partnerships for the past 3 years." Watching him process the numbers and the implications while guests around us remained riveted to this unfolding drama. I pulled my phone from my clutch with deliberate slowness, opened my email, and scrolled to a message thread from 2 weeks earlier before turning the screen toward Derek and the nearby tables. "This is the approval I sent for TechVision's last 3 campaign strategies," I said, watching his eyes scan the emails that clearly showed my name, my signature, my authority over work he'd probably taken full credit for in meetings and performance reviews. "I sign off on every major client campaign personally. It's company policy for contracts over $1 million. So yes, Derek, I've been involved in your career success quite directly, though you didn't seem to realize it until just now." Brad was shaking his head slightly. Whether in amazement at the situation or embarrassment at his colleague's behavior, I couldn't tell. But he spoke up again to confirm, "Those are legitimate Catalyst emails. I recognize the format, and the campaign details are accurate." Derek's parents looked thoroughly confused now, his mother leaning toward her husband to whisper something while casting concerned glances at their son, whose evening had deteriorated so spectacularly. Claire recovered her voice then, though it came out strained and defensive when she said, "Maya, you could have mentioned this before. You didn't have to let us all think you were working some entry-level job." And the attempt to shift blame onto me for their assumptions was so characteristic that I almost smiled. "I tried to mention it," I said, turning to face my sister directly, my voice clear enough that everyone in the private dining room could hear. "At Mom's birthday dinner 8 months ago, when you asked about my work, I started to explain about the company, and you interrupted to talk about your promotion at the law firm. At Christmas, when Derek asked what I did, I mentioned I ran a digital marketing agency, and he spent 20 minutes explaining to me how digital marketing works, as though I'd never heard of it. 3 weeks ago at brunch, I tried to tell you about winning the Cascade Industry Award, and you changed the subject to wedding planning before I finished my second sentence." The specific examples hung in the air like evidence in a trial, each one a small indictment of the casual dismissal I'd endured, and I watched Claire's face flush as she realized other people were hearing this accounting of her behavior. My mother stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor, and she attempted a smile that looked more like a grimace when she said, "Maya, darling, I've always known you were doing well. A mother always knows these things. I'm very proud of you." But the words rang hollow in the face of years of evidence to the contrary, and I shook my head gently. "Mom, you told me at your birthday that I should consider going back to school for a real career because marketing was oversaturated," I said quietly, watching her attempt at revisionism crumble, and before she could formulate another response, Claire's voice cut through the room, sharp and defensive. This is exactly like you, Maya. Hiding something this big just so you could make us all look bad? You set this whole thing up to humiliate me at my own engagement party, Claire said, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. And I felt something shift in my chest because even now, even confronted with years of her own dismissive behavior, she was making herself the victim. I wanted to be valued for who I am, not for my bank account, I said, turning to face her directly, keeping my voice level despite the frustration rising in my throat. I wanted family dinners where someone asked about my life because they cared, not because they wanted something. I wanted relationships that weren't based on what I could do for other people financially. The words came easier now, years of swallowed feelings finally given voice, and I continued before she could interrupt. Speaking of finances, do you remember 3 years ago when you borrowed $5,000 from me for your emergency root canal? Claire's expression shifted to something guarded and I pressed on. I didn't need the money back, I was already doing well by then, but Claire, you never even acknowledged it, you never said thank you or I'll pay you back when I can. You just took it like it was owed to you, and then 6 months later you mocked my apartment for being small. Several guests had the grace to look uncomfortable now, witnessing this family dysfunction play out in real time, and Claire opened her mouth to respond, but I wasn't finished. And I know you've asked Dad for $15,000 toward the wedding, I said, watching her face go pale, because he told me last month when I had dinner with him, he mentioned you'd come to him saying you were struggling financially and needed help with wedding costs. My father across the room nodded slowly, his expression sad but confirmatory, and I saw understanding dawn on several faces about what I was revealing. Dad also mentioned that in the same conversation where you asked for money, you told him you were worried about me because I seemed to be barely scraping by. You suggested he should offer to help me with rent, I continued, and the hypocrisy of it hung in the air like smoke. So you asked our father for wedding money while simultaneously criticizing my supposed poverty to him, never once considering that maybe you didn't actually know anything about my financial situation because you'd never bothered to ask. Claire's mouth opened and closed without sound, her earlier righteous anger deflating as guests processed this information, and Derek stepped closer to her side with a hand on her arm, his voice suddenly respectful in a way it hadn't been all evening when he said, Ms. Chen, I think maybe we should all take a moment to calm down. Ms. Chen, I apologize if I came across as dismissive earlier, Derek said, his voice suddenly carrying the careful modulation of someone who'd just realized they'd made a catastrophic professional error. And the transformation from his earlier condescension was so complete, it might have been fascinating if it weren't so transparently self-serving. Catalyst Digital's work with TechVision has been exceptional, truly innovative strategies that have elevated our entire marketing approach, he continued, the compliments flowing with practiced corporate smoothness. And I maintained a professional expression while internally noting how quickly respect appeared when someone realized you held power over their career trajectory. I appreciate that, Derek, I said, keeping my tone neutral and businesslike, the same voice I used in difficult client meetings when emotions needed to stay contained. Though I should mention that TechVision's contract with Catalyst comes up for renewal next month, and I sit on the committee that makes those decisions. I wasn't threatening him, wasn't implying anything beyond the simple statement of fact, but I watched the color drain from his face as the implications settled over him like a heavy blanket. His evening had started with him condescending to someone he viewed as beneath him professionally, and now that same person had revealed she held significant influence over a multi-million-dollar contract that likely justified a substantial portion of his salary and certainly his recent promotion. Brad stepped forward then, his earlier discomfort evolving into something that looked like genuine remorse when he said, Ms. Chen, I need to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I recognized you when I arrived, but I didn't realize Derek didn't know who you were, and I should have said something before the situation became so uncomfortable. I turned to him and felt my expression soften slightly, because there was real sincerity in his apology, not the calculated damage control that motivated Derek's sudden respect. I appreciate that, Brad, and I understand the awkwardness of the position you were in, I said. And I meant it because navigating social situations where your colleague is unknowingly insulting an important client was genuinely difficult territory. Other guests had begun approaching me now, the shift in the room's social dynamics, nearly tangible as people who'd witnessed my earlier dismissal suddenly wanted to offer congratulations and express interest in my work. Derek's parents moved closer. His mother's face creased with embarrassment when she said, "We're so sorry for any assumptions we made earlier, Maya. Derek had given us the impression that you were just starting out in your career, and we clearly had incomplete information." Her apology was gracious, and I accepted it with a nod, recognizing that they'd simply been working with what their son had told them, probably had no idea he'd spent the evening patronizing someone who held professional authority over his career. I glanced at Claire, who stood near the gift table, her arms crossed and her expression caught somewhere between residual anger and something that might have been uncertainty, the social calculus of the evening having shifted so dramatically that even she seemed unsure how to proceed. My mother found me near the restaurant's coat check, about 20 minutes after my exchange with Derek's parents, her hand light on my elbow as she guided me toward a quieter alcove near the bar, and I could see in her expression that carefully constructed blend of concern and determination that meant she was about to attempt damage control. "Maya, sweetheart, can we talk for just a moment?" she said, her voice carrying that particular tone she used when she wanted something, softer than her usual briskness, and I nodded because I'd known this conversation was coming the moment I'd revealed the truth about Catalyst Digital. "I just want you to know that I've always been proud of you, always knew you were special and would accomplish remarkable things," she began, reaching for my hand in a gesture that might have seemed maternal to anyone watching, and I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest because even now, even after everything, she was rewriting history rather than acknowledging it. "Mom, you told me 8 months ago at your birthday dinner that I should consider going back to school for a real career because marketing was oversaturated and unstable," I said quietly, watching her face shift as the specific memory punctured her revisionism, and she started to speak, but I continued. "And 2 years ago, when I mentioned I was thinking about expanding my business, you suggested I not get ahead of myself and remember that most small businesses fail within 5 years. The details came easily because I'd replayed these moments so many times in private, each one a small cut that had accumulated into something deeper, and my mother's expression flickered between defensiveness and something that might have been guilt. "I was just trying to protect you from disappointment. You've always been so sensitive, and I didn't want to see you hurt if things didn't work out," she said, the excuses flowing in that reasonable tone that had always made me question my own perceptions, but I was done questioning myself. "What about my college graduation?" I asked, keeping my voice level despite the old hurt rising in my throat. "The one where you didn't come because Claire had a gallery opening for her photography class? A class assignment that wasn't even graded. And you said we could celebrate my graduation another time, but we never did." I watched my mother's face pale slightly as other guests moved past us toward their tables, the party continuing around our small bubble of confrontation. "Or my 30th birthday last year when you forgot to call until 3 days later, but you'd posted all over Facebook about Claire's birthday 6 months before that, with a photo album of 70 pictures spanning her whole life." My mother opened her mouth to respond, closed it again, and I could see her mentally cataloging these moments, perhaps realizing for the first time how they'd accumulated into a pattern she could no longer dismiss as isolated incidents or my oversensitivity. "I love you, Mom. I do. But I'm not going to pretend the past didn't happen just because the present has become uncomfortable for you," I said, feeling tears prick at my eyes, but keeping my voice steady. And I saw something shift in her expression, a crack in the defensive wall she'd constructed. "I spent so many years trying to earn your approval, trying to be impressive enough or successful enough or just enough in general to warrant the same attention you gave Claire automatically," I continued, the words flowing now after being held back for so long. And I finally realized that I was chasing something you weren't willing to give, that your view of me was fixed a long time ago, as the quiet daughter who needed less, who wanted less, who deserved less of your energy and pride and time. My mother's eyes were bright with tears now, her hand, still holding mine, but with a desperation that hadn't been there before, and she said, "Maya, please, you're my daughter. I never meant to make you feel that way. We can fix this. We can start fresh right now." I felt the pull of that offer, the temptation to accept this immediate reconciliation and smooth over decades of accumulated hurt with a simple agreement to move forward. But I'd learned enough about myself in building Catalyst to know that real foundations required acknowledging what had come before. "Are you coming to Claire's wedding? Will you still be part of the family?" my mother asked, the question carrying an edge of panic, and I recognized it as the moment she was beginning to understand that her relationship with me had fundamentally shifted and might not return to the comfortable dynamic where I accepted whatever scraps of attention she offered. "I don't know yet, Mom. I need to think about a lot of things," I said, gently extracting my hand from hers, and I turned back toward the main room where the party continued, leaving her standing in the alcove with an expression that suggested she was finally beginning to count the cost of years of casual dismissal. I found the restaurant's balcony almost by instinct, pushing through the glass door into the cool Seattle night air where the sounds of the party faded to a muffled background hum, and I stood at the railing looking out at the city lights while my hands gripped the metal hard enough that my knuckles went white. I heard the door open behind me a few minutes later and turned to see Jen stepping out, her expression concerned but not pitying, and she came to stand beside me without speaking right away, just her presence offering the kind of support that didn't require words. "You knew, didn't you?" I said finally. Not quite a question, because I'd seen the lack of surprise on her face during my revelations, and she nodded slowly while wrapping her cardigan tighter against the breeze. "I've known for 3 years, Maya, since that conference in Portland where I saw your keynote speech on digital transformation strategies and nearly fell out of my chair," she said with a small smile. "And I remembered that conference, remembered seeing a familiar face in the audience. But the moment had passed so quickly in the blur of presenting to 400 marketing professionals. Why didn't you ever say anything? Why didn't you ask why I never told them?" I asked, genuinely curious because Jen had sat through family dinners and gatherings where Claire and my mother had made their dismissive comments, and she'd never once broken my unintentional cover. "Because I figured you had your reasons and it wasn't my story to tell," she said simply, turning to look at me with the kind of understanding that came from 15 years of friendship. "And honestly, Maya, watching you build something incredible while your family remained clueless was like watching the universe set up the world's most justified reality check. I knew eventually the truth would come out." We stood in comfortable silence for a moment before the balcony door opened again and my father stepped out, his tall frame backlit by the restaurant's interior lighting, and he approached with an uncertainty in his movements that made him seem smaller than his 6'2" height. "Maya, can I join you, or would you prefer some time alone?" he asked, his voice carrying none of the booming confidence he usually projected, and I nodded toward the space beside me at the railing. "Dad, I should apologize for not defending you more actively in there, for not standing up to your mother and Claire when they dismissed your work and your achievements," he said, the words coming out in a rush as though he'd been rehearsing them, and I saw genuine remorse in his expression when I glanced at him. "I've let myself be intimidated by your mother's strong personality for years. Even after the divorce, I somehow still defer to her judgment in family situations. But that's not an excuse for failing to support my own daughter." His honesty surprised me because my father had always been more comfortable with surface-level interactions, preferring to avoid confrontation, and I felt something shift in my chest as I recognized this vulnerability as its own form of courage. "I'm proud of you, Maya. So incredibly proud of what you've built and who you've become. And I'd like to be more involved in your life if you're willing to give me that chance," he continued, his hand coming to rest on the railing near mine, and I felt tears prick at my eyes again, but these felt different from the earlier ones, cleaner somehow. Tell me about Catalyst Digital. Really tell me. I want to hear about how you built it and what you do and what challenges you're facing, my father said, turning to face me fully. And I saw Jen step back slightly to give us space while remaining close enough to be included. I started talking then, really talking about my company for the first time with family present, and my father asked questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite obligation, wanted to understand the details of campaign strategies and client relationships, and the specific challenges of scaling a digital agency in an oversaturated market. And I realized with a clarity that felt like dawn breaking that some relationships could be repaired when both parties were willing to acknowledge what had broken and do the work of rebuilding. I stayed on the balcony with Jen and my father for another 15 minutes, the conversation gradually shifting from heavy emotional territory to lighter ground as Dad asked about my favorite client projects, and Jen shared a story about her own work challenges, and I felt something in my chest loosen as I realized this was what family conversation should feel like, curious and supportive rather than competitive and dismissive. Eventually, we returned to the main dining room where the party had continued without us, the energy slightly subdued now as guests clustered in small groups, and I could feel eyes tracking my movement as I made my way back to my table, the revelation of my identity having transformed me from dismissed younger sister to person of interest and influence. Derek intercepted me near the dessert table, his approach tentative in a way that would have been laughable 4 hours earlier when he'd been holding court about the tech industry, and he cleared his throat twice before speaking. Maya, Ms. Chen, I owe you an apology for my behavior this evening. I was incredibly unprofessional and disrespectful, he said, the words clearly rehearsed, but his discomfort genuine, and I could see in his expression that he was thinking about the $2.3 million contract renewal I'd mentioned, the professional consequences of having spent an entire evening condescending to someone who held significant influence over his company's marketing partnerships. I appreciate that, Derek, I said, keeping my tone professionally courteous, but not warm, the same voice I used with clients who needed gentle correction. And I want you to know that business decisions at Catalyst are made based on merit and results, not personal feelings. I watched relief flicker across his face before I continued. That said, professionalism and respect are important values in any partnership, and how people treat others when they believe there's no professional benefit at stake tells me a lot about their character and judgment. Derek's face paled slightly as he absorbed the implication, understanding that while I wasn't going to tank TechVision's contract out of spite, his behavior tonight would factor into my overall assessment of the partnership's health and sustainability. Of course, absolutely. I understand completely, he stammered. And I noticed Claire watching our interaction from across the room, her expression calculating rather than angry now, as though she was reassessing the situation and determining her next move. She approached a few minutes after Derek retreated, her movements careful and her smile controlled, and she stood beside me in a posture that might have looked sisterly to observers who didn't know the history between us. Maya, this has been quite an evening. Maybe we should talk about starting over, putting all this behind us and moving forward as sisters should, she said, her voice carrying that reasonable tone she used when she wanted something. And I recognized this as a strategic retreat rather than genuine reconciliation. Claire, I'm open to rebuilding our relationship, but it can't be based on pretending the past didn't happen, I said quietly, watching her face carefully. It would require you acknowledging how you've treated me over the years. Really acknowledging it, not just apologizing because circumstances have changed. I saw resistance flicker in her expression, that familiar stubbornness that hated admitting fault, but underneath it was something newer, a wariness that suggested she understood the power dynamic between us had fundamentally shifted. I don't know if I'm ready for that conversation right now. Tonight has been a lot, she said finally, which wasn't agreement, but wasn't outright refusal either. And I nodded because I understood that real change, if it came at all, would take time. I collected my coat 20 minutes later and said my goodbyes to the guests who mattered, hugging Jen and kissing my father's cheek and nodding politely to Derek's parents. And I walked out of Meridian Restaurant with my dignity fully intact, leaving behind a family party that would never see me the same way again. 1 week after the engagement party, I stood in my corner office on the 23rd floor of the Columbia Tower, the floor-to-ceiling windows offering an unobstructed view of Elliott Bay and the Seattle skyline that never failed to remind me of how far I'd come from that uncertain 24-year-old starting a business in her studio apartment. And my assistant, Rebecca, knocked twice before entering with the leather portfolio containing contract renewal recommendations that required my review and signature. "The Tech Vision Solutions renewal is in there," she said, her tone carefully neutral because she'd been with me for 4 years and had developed an instinct for when business intersected with personal matters. Marcus and the team put together a comprehensive analysis of their account performance over the past 18 months. I nodded and she left me to review the documents, and I opened the portfolio to find a thorough assessment of TechVision's campaigns, their ROI metrics, their responsiveness as a client, their payment history, all the data points that informed whether a partnership should continue. I read through every page carefully, forcing myself to evaluate the information with the same professional objectivity I applied to every contract decision, and the truth was that TechVision had been a solid client who paid on time, implemented our recommendations, and achieved measurable results that reflected well on both companies. I signed the renewal recommendation based on merit rather than spite, and as I placed the document in my outbox, I felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my integrity remained intact despite the personal complications Derek's engagement to my sister had created. My phone buzzed with an email notification, and I glanced at the screen to see a message from Derek himself, the subject line reading simply, "Thank you," and when I opened it, I found 3 paragraphs that struck me as genuinely humble, rather than strategically crafted. He acknowledged his behavior at the engagement party, admitted that he'd made assumptions about me based on Claire's dismissive comments without ever bothering to verify them, and expressed gratitude for my professionalism in separating business from personal matters. "I'm deeply embarrassed by how I treated you, and I'm working on examining my own biases about what success looks like and how I evaluate people's worth," he wrote. And while I wasn't ready to develop any kind of friendship with my future brother-in-law, I appreciated that the evening had at least prompted some self-reflection. Brad, Derek's colleague, who had reluctantly confirmed my identity at the party, sent a separate email requesting a coffee meeting to discuss digital marketing trends, and his message felt genuine rather than opportunistic, so I agreed to meet him the following Tuesday at the cafe near my office. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Claire, her message attempting casual, sisterly conversation about wedding flowers and venue decisions, and I responded with polite brevity that didn't pretend we'd suddenly achieved the closeness she was performing. My mother had called 4 times in the past week, leaving increasingly emotional voicemails that oscillated between defensive justifications and tearful apologies, and I'd answered twice, keeping the conversations short while maintaining the boundaries I'd finally learned to set. But my father had visited my office 2 days after the party, arriving without announcement and asking if I had time for lunch, and we'd gone to the seafood restaurant on the waterfront where he'd asked detailed questions about Catalyst Digital's structure and my vision for its future. And I'd felt something warm and unfamiliar bloom in my chest as I realized this was what it felt like to have a parent who showed genuine interest in my life and accomplishments. Jen had come over to my apartment that weekend with champagne and takeout, and we'd sat on my balcony overlooking Lake Union while she'd told me how proud she was that I'd finally stood up for myself. And I'd felt grateful for friendships that had remained steady even when family relationships had frayed. 3 months after the engagement party, I sat at my desk on a Wednesday afternoon reviewing expansion proposals for Catalyst Digital's potential Portland office, and I realized that the knot of anxiety that used to tighten in my chest whenever my phone displayed my mother's number had loosened considerably, not because our relationship had magically healed, but because I'd finally learned that my worth wasn't contingent on her approval or recognition. My mother had been calling more regularly, and our conversations had gradually shifted from her defensive justifications to something resembling genuine curiosity about my life. Though I noticed she still struggled to ask about my company without immediately comparing it to Claire's wedding plans, or mentioning how proud she was of both her daughters in a way that felt more like reputation management than authentic feeling. Claire's wedding was now just 3 weeks away, and after considerable reflection and a long conversation with my father, I decided to attend as a guest rather than accepting the bridesmaid position. She'd offered in a transparent attempt to project family unity, and when I'd communicated this boundary, Claire had been hurt in that specific way that suggested she was more bothered by how it looked than by any genuine desire for my participation. Derek had remained professionally respectful in our business interactions, and the coffee meeting with Brad had evolved into a genuine professional connection as he'd proven to be sincerely interested in digital marketing innovation rather than simply networking for advantage. And I'd found myself grateful that at least one positive relationship had emerged from that difficult evening. My company had grown substantially in the past 3 months, adding 15 new employees and signing contracts with two major clients who'd approached us after word spread through industry networks about our work. And I'd been featured in Seattle Business Magazine, in an article about young entrepreneurs that my father had framed and hung in his home office, a gesture that meant more to me than he probably realized. I'd also started seeing someone, a software developer named James, who'd attended a tech industry mixer where I'd been a panelist. And what struck me most about our developing relationship was that he'd known from the beginning that I was CEO of Catalyst Digital and had never seemed intimidated or competitive about it, just genuinely interested in my work, the way I was interested in his, and the ease of being with someone who valued me for who I was, rather than what I could do for them, felt like drinking cold water after years of thirst. The previous evening, I'd hosted a small dinner party at my apartment, just 8 people around my dining table: Jen and her partner, my father and his longtime girlfriend Patricia, James, Brad and his wife, and my assistant Rebecca, who'd become a friend over the years. And as I'd looked around the table at people who genuinely cared about me and saw me clearly, I'd felt a profound sense of peace that had nothing to do with vindication or proving anyone wrong, and everything to do with finally understanding that I'd built a life where I was valued. I no longer needed my family to acknowledge what they'd missed or apologize for how they'd treated me, though I remained open to rebuilding relationships with those who were willing to do the genuine work of change. And I'd learned that standing up for myself that night at the engagement party hadn't been about revenge, but about finally respecting myself enough to stop accepting crumbs of attention and affection from people who should have offered me full seats at their tables. And in the quiet moments when I looked out my office windows at the city I'd built my success in, I understood that the greatest victory wasn't in proving my worth to people who doubted me, but in finally believing in it myself deeply enough that their doubt no longer had the power to diminish me.